Welcome to Conversations on Healthcare. This week, veteran journalist Thalia Assuras interviews author Charles Barber on his new book, Peace and Health, about co-host Mark Maselli's half-century quest to address health inequity. Now, here is guest host Thalia Assuras with Charlie Barber.
Hello, everyone. A half century ago, a group of small-town activists and students in Middletown, Connecticut, set out to change healthcare. Now, this was daring, it was radical, and it was profoundly just. That is the description that you'll find in this new book, Peace and Health, the history of the Community Health Center Incorporated. It's written by Charlie Barber. He is a writer in residence at Wesleyan University. He's a renowned author of nonfiction books, and you will have read his writing in places such as the Washington Post and the New York Times. Charlie, welcome to Conversations on Healthcare.
Thank you, Thalia.
You know, hitting a 50th anniversary is a big milestone, and I had the opportunity to speak with Mark Maselli and Margaret Flinter about that accomplishment on a previous program. But now a book. Why a book, and who's going to pick it up?
One of the reviewers of the book said it reads like a novel, but it's all true. And it's the story of a 20-year-old who's a college dropout who bands together with a group of 5, kind of a motley crew of people in Middletown in the early 70s. They include a pharmacist, business person, a leader of the African-American spiritual community, another college student at Wesleyan who becomes a U.S. senator, a former jazz musician who has kind of fallen on hard times, and then later a nurse practitioner. And they all rally around this cry of healthcare as a right and not a privilege, which is sort of a radical idea now and certainly back then. And so I wanted to tell the story of how they pulled it off.
So you talk about a lot of different people in there, and we're really talking about people of all ages, races, and faiths. And I'm wondering how it is that they actually got together. That's really hard to do, especially when you think about the tumultuous times we're in now. So I'm wondering at the same time if you think it could happen now.
Well, it's interesting. I teach at Wesleyan, and Mark came to my class as we were, working on the book. And Mark explained the origin story of him as a 20-year-old and starting a very kind of a clinic that looked like it was out of Haight-Ashbury with beads hanging down, and it was a substance use counseling center and a place for draft counseling against the Vietnam War. Then he found a new site and built it by hand with a kind of edgy carpenter, and Mark didn't really have the money to pay him, and this was sort of the first 2 years, and then they were shut down by essentially the power base in Middletown. And the students, my students, this is a year ago, said, you could never do this now.
Really?
It just wouldn't happen. There'd be so many things that would get in your way. And Mark, who is the center, and he's the one who connected all these people, and I can explain that in a moment. Mark said, absolutely not. You can do it now. The rules are a little bit different, but I'm here to tell you that this story can be done now. The tools are different. But Mark would say it's the rallying around an idea and having a big tent to get members of the community that represent different interests to come together. And that's how you do it. And you can do that now or in 1972.
That's good to know. That makes me feel a whole lot better right now.
Yes.
But Mark is the one, you mentioned that Mark is the one who is the magnet, really. What was it and what is it in his personality that brought all these people together?
And you said it right. What is it? Because it's still very much there 50 years later. It's an extraordinary, part of it's just a work ethic. I mean, just a flat out work ethic. It's an extraordinary attention to detail and sort of willfulness. And he was profoundly inspired by this idea that healthcare is a right and not a privilege. And then as now, Middletown, where this all started, is like most places in America, a place of the haves and the have-nots. And he was even as a 20-year-old. I think inspired by the civil rights movement, and then later he had personal connections with Desmond Tutu and with the Dalai Lama. And it's remarkable because he doesn't come from a healthcare background, and he had dropped out of college. And I think it was a profound sense of social justice. And he talks about his mother taking Mark and his brother to Alabama or Mississippi in the early 60s, and him being shocked as a young kid by the poverty. And it was just it was a seismic thing for him. I think he was maybe 7 years old. And then, 10 years later, he's shocked to find the same level of poverty in the African American community in Middletown. And
in his own backyard.
In his own backyard. And one of the principal drivers of this sort of team of people that created the community health center is in fact a representative of that community who is sort of the spiritual advisor to the organization until her death about 13 years ago.
Right. So we're starting to talk now. You're moving us into talking specifically about some of those key people who were on the team, and I think you're talking about Reba Moses.
I am.
Not as one of the original board members, daughter of a sharecropper in the Carolinas. Tell us more about her and her influence.
Well, Mark first, and I think you asked sort of how did Mark do it. I think there's this sort of fearlessness as a 20-year-old, just sort of talking to people, talking it up. So he literally walked into her neighborhood, and where she was living at the time, which was, the kind of the other side of the tracks, quite literally in Middletown, was a place on South Street where there was flooding in the spring, and she would literally have to move out, for like weeks until the water subsided. Again, it was shocking to him. And then he became almost like a member of her family. She was a matriarch of her community and took a shine to Mark. And I think he saw her as a kind of a mother figure and a matriarch. And then she became one of the first board members and became sort of the conscience of the organization over many years from her experience of hardship.
And actually, too, we were talking about students who were part of the team. And I believe, if I'm correct, that young John Hickenlooper, helped Mark found CHC. He's a current U.S. Senator. Tell us about that relationship and why that was important in the early years.
Well, they first met because Mark, or I guess Hick, as Mark calls him, Hick, needed a roommate, and Mark answered an ad, or vice versa, and they show up together and they have the same bicycle, and so they talk about bikes for forever. And this begins they become roommates, and Hickenlooper is around Wesleyan for about 10 years. He's sort of on the 10-year plan at Wesleyan. He ends up getting a bachelor's and a master's degree. John told me that the faculty held him a special party when he finally graduated. And Hickenlooper, as the budding, legislator, becomes a strategic partner with Mark. And the particular fight that they fight is with the city of Middletown around the allocation of HUD money, which is held back essentially for political reasons from the city to the early community health center. This is sort of mid-70s to early 80s. And Hickenlooper and Mark study up on the HUD regs. Mark goes to Washington and wins the fight. And this was essential funding at that time. And so it's Hickenlooper who is the great friend, also supports the purchase of the first building personally, but is also the strategic advisor.
Right. And in many ways, they were part of that whole student unrest as well. Were they not at Wesleyan, on campus and around campus? And that kind of propelled them at the same time and those around them to make up this team. Would you say that? Absolutely.
It started in 1971, the prototype of the clinic, of what became the community health center. And if you really trace it back, in the tumult around the Vietnam War, Wesleyan students went on strike against the Vietnam War, which They also decided not to go to class for a month. And there were literally red fists painted on the sidewalks all around campus. And so campus essentially closed down. And so Wesleyan students sort of started hanging out downtown, and the bridge between town and gown sort of separated or faded out. And so it was Hickenlooper and a couple other Wesleyan students or temporary dropouts from Wesleyan that also banded together with Mark, and all inspired again by the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement to do something in our backyard that sort of reflects the national civil rights movement.
And indeed, again, he attracted Mark and the others, attracted a team, for example, to include Gerry Weitzman, a local pharmacist who was also, like Reba Moses, a mentor to Mark. Tell us about that relationship, Gerry Weitzman.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the two people that just made it happen, it was a group of five, but the two most prominent in that group are Reba, and then the other was Gerry Weitzman, who was a pharmacist. His grandparents and parents had escaped Eastern Europe and the pogroms in Eastern Europe. And Gerry was a very successful business person on Main Street, highly respected in the business community. Mark walked into his pharmacy one day and said, "Look, I'm setting up this clinic. I have no money. Can you do something for me?" And Gerry, who was a reserved guy, kind of said, "Oh yeah, sure." And then later that afternoon, Gerry pulled up with his station wagon and dropped off medical equipment for free. Gerry became the chairman of the board of directors for, I don't know, the next 25 years until his untimely death in his late 50s in a car accident. And Gerry, among other things, becomes the business advisor and also sort of vouches for Mark because he's the liaison to the business community and the establishment and kind of saying, yeah, his hair's down halfway down his back and it's a little funky, but he's all right. And that, in terms of credibility with the local community, was huge.
Yeah, I want to get to Gerry's tragic death because it had an influence in terms of the future as well. But let me ask about one more character first, and that's James Moody, who was a big band musician in the 1930s, lost all his teeth, which is tragic as well. But with CHC, he became a patient board member after help, free dental care, free health care, and he healed physically and emotionally. So he paid it forward, didn't he?
He did, and he's sort of the one of the other members of this band in the early days. And one of Mark's insights early on was to provide dental services first, partially because the first thing they got donated was a dental chair. But Mark was thinking sort of holistically around behavioral health care and dental care and medical care from the get-go, which was, pretty ahead of its time. So James was one of the first patients. He had lost his teeth. He couldn't play his, instruments anymore. So early CHC provided him with new teeth, which was, transformational for him, both physically and sort of his self-image. So James became, again, another early board member, and the first board member who was specifically a patient, which led very quickly to most of the board members, which is now the case as we speak, being patients. Another idea sort of 20 years ahead of its time to have the leadership of the organization having patient representation, and James was a pioneer in that regard.
And that is so unusual to have a patient on the board. Why was it so important for CHC to have that element?
I think this is an example of Mark not having the credentials and the formal education, not knowing the rules, and which is that you can't have patients, it's like the inmates running the asylum back in the day. And he just thinking, well, patients know the quality of the services and what's being given to them and their issues obviously better than anybody else. They're who we're working for. Why not? Mark didn't know that this was essentially taboo in the hospital down the street. That was one of the reasons why they kind of got into trouble. Meanwhile, 30 years later, it's now best practice in progressive organizations around the country in healthcare that you have, huge patient representation. So I think it's an artifact of being an outsider and just having some common sense ideas and not knowing what you couldn't do.
You brought up Gerry Weitzman died tragically in a car accident, and you quoted Mark as saying in a very poignant chapter, the best way to honor Gerry's memory is to go out and do things with great love. And that's actually happened through the Weitzman Institute, named after Gerry, obviously. Tell us more about that, the Institute, and how it has taken CHC forward nationally and internationally.
So Gerry died just a random, insane tragedy of someone running into his car with a wife and two friends, and they were all killed. Going to a baseball game on a Friday night. This is late 90s. And Margaret Flinter, who became the fifth member of the team, she joined a little bit later, and she kind of shored up CHC's clinical game starting in the 80s when she joined. Margaret said about Gerry, he never rejected a good idea. And so he was a businessman and a pharmacist, but he was, a healthcare professional who followed the research. And so when Gerry died, Mark and Margaret, over time, created a research institute under his name, the Weitzman Institute, which is now a major part of the Community Health Center, and has really been the intellectual factory that has sprung the organization forward nationally, and is leading educational efforts and telehealth that's impacting more than 1 million lives now.
Now, and a $200 million budget, I understand, but that wasn't the case, as you pointed out earlier. And in fact, federal funding had been a problem. Many people had expected the Clinton administration to boost funding for CHC. It didn't. That happened under the two President Bushes. How did it happen that way?
So the first President Bush signed legislation in 1990 that, 3,000 people in the United States were following. It led to an incredible transformation in healthcare, not just for the Community Health Center, but nationally for other similarly Medicaid-funded clinics. And what it did is it tripled the reimbursement rate for services that the Community Health Center and other organizations were providing. It also made drugs for patients much more attainable, and it also helped with things like malpractice insurance. It was absolutely transformational to this community health center starting in 1990. It made them go, it was a sea change. It made them go from as worthy as what they were doing was kind of just getting by to a viable business model. And so between 1990 and 2000, they opened 10 major new clinics, bricks and mortar clinics in cities all over Connecticut, thereby setting them up to create a national research institute in the 2000s.
And so let's bring us to today and the COVID crisis, in which CHC has been prominent. And perhaps a lot of people don't know this. And there are these terrific stories in the book and photographs about the great efforts of CHC in vaccines and in testing, almost military style. You say in the book that CHC was made for this moment. What do you mean by that? Explain it a bit more.
Well, the moment was January 21. So the vaccines had just come out literally a month before. And the Community Health Center had done an extraordinary job with testing, which was such a big deal before the vaccines. Testing hundreds of thousands of people with, bodysuits and people driving up, those really nightmarish days. Not that we're out of it now. And that had gotten the state's attention. And I think the key to it was the entrepreneurial spirit that goes back to the early days of Gerry Weitzman, of having, people that run businesses at the till, at the helm of the Community Health Center, and Mark's sort of entrepreneurial, let's do it sort of spirit. And so out of that, Mark received a call like January 8th, I believe, 2021 from the state. Mark, can you set up a mass vaccine site on an abandoned airstrip in East Hartford, where we're going to, do maybe 2,000 to 3,000 vaccines a day. We're going to have people drive in. Nobody had done this in the country at this point. Mark says, yes, I'll do it. When do you want it? We want it in a week. And then the other thing that I thought was really interesting that's in the book is then, and this is a senior official from the Department of Public Health, do you want a contract? Mark said, no, we'll do it without a contract. So this is a huge risk, right? And Mark's reasoning, and he dealt with the state for 40 years. One, he ultimately trusted the state that they would, make it good. Second, he knew that if, a contract and lawyers got involved, it would take 6 months. And the more established players like Yale New Haven and Hartford Hospital would do it. They wouldn't do it as quick as CHC, but they would do it. So literally, I think 10 days later, they have this set up. And as you say, a military operation, literally with the National Guard there with, 500 cones and almost like an old toll station off of a highway, people driving up. And this became the second mass vaccine site in the country, second only to Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles that opened 2 days before. And kind of brought, first of all, it's the great thing to do. I think CHC has vaccinated almost 1 million people against COVID at this point. People came from half the eastern United States to this site. And it brought the community health center to a national level of prominence. This was on, the CNN and the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal and a front page story in the New York Times. And sort of, this was almost in their 50th year anniversary. It sort of brought home all of the ambitions of this 20-year-old kid, camping out to try and find a site for his clinic that he'd just been shut down the street, trying to find a new one, gets a new one, does carpentry for 6 months. Totally different, but totally the same. It's an impossible thing to do. I'm going to do it. And so
such faith and confidence that this could be done, that he and his team could absolutely do this. And I think the final tally was, you said, about 1 million, nearly 800,000 Connecticut residents got the vaccine through CHC. It's the largest vaccine provider in the state. And they actually got some recognition from the White House with some Easter eggs. Tell us that story.
So another kind of funny story. So Mark gets a call from the folks at the main office saying there's a big package. It's not clear what it is. It's to you, and it's from the White House. And what is it? Is it a joke? Is it this? Is it that? Is it dangerous? So Mark, comes over, and it's hundreds and hundreds of wooden Easter eggs that were given to 20 organizations nationally in recognition of their COVID efforts. And it was Easter, and so the Easter bunny in costume at various mass vaccine sites literally gave them out to patients. As a matter of fact, I got my vaccine that day, and I got one of the Easter eggs.
Lucky you.
Yes, and it incredibly powerful emotional experience for me personally.
And this is all really inspiring. You've told us inspiring stories. What do you think is really going to inspire the reader in picking up this book?
That ideas change the world. I think in these hard times, and I'm thinking of my college students at Wesleyan encountering Mark in the research for the book. They're in the middle of COVID that's destroying their college years. Their first year in college was, you can't leave the dorm essentially. And so I think a book like this, like Peace and Health, tells the students and a younger generation, because I think I kind of had a younger generation in mind writing the book, that the tumult in which the Community Health Center was created, Vietnam, civil rights, poverty, incredible divides, incredible violence in the United States, arguably there hasn't been that much divisiveness until now. And out of the crucible of that hatred and fear came the community health center and the Vietnam War. And so I think the ultimate message that I don't say in the book, but I think was sort of, in my head as I'm writing it and why I was attracted to the story, is you can do it now. And as Mark said to my students, he had his back up when he said it to them, because they said, you just couldn't do this now. You get in trouble. Mark got the Wesleyan Buildings and Grounds people. He was not affiliated officially with Wesleyan at that time, to install the first dental chair, to lift it up and do the platform. And I know the students are thinking that would be over social media in 10 seconds, and everybody would get fired. And Mark said to them, no, you just do something different. You just figure it out. So why now? Why this book? As schmaltzy as it sounds, but it's not schmaltzy, and I'll explain that in a second, the message of out of great trouble, out of the crucible, can come something like this. And I think the reason why it's not schmaltzy, it's not just the idea and the sentiment and this wonderfully diverse group of people, it was the work. They were hippies, but not really. They were organized, right? So John Hickenlooper, his hair was sort of down, not quite Mark's length, but, sort of scraggly looking. But the strategic mind of a future senator, the business mind of he was among the most successful business people in Middletown. The spiritual mind of a sort of renowned leader in the community, of Reba Moses. And so they have the romantic idea, which is peace and health, but they're workers and they're technicians and they're strategists. So I think the other way that this book can be helpful is as a roadmap of how one organizes politically and strategically, and how one goes across the aisle, whether it's Democrats to Republicans, or 20-year-olds to 50-year-olds, or blacks or Jewish folks, or white folks. It doesn't matter. College students. That you cross the aisle, and there's power in that true diversity of differing expertise.
Well, I suspect that there will be a next book. Charlie Barber, thanks for joining us. And the book Peace and Health is available on Amazon.com. It's in hardcover, as you can see. It's an ebook and an audiobook version. And in fact, those who are aficionados of audiobooks will want to know that George Goodell, the king of audiobooks, narrates the book. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. You can learn more about conversations on healthcare and sign up for the email updates at chcradio.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Thalia.